Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. In the winter of 1861, while Americans were still arguing over whether the war would last months or years, foreign capitals were already running their numbers. In London, a cabinet meeting turned heated over a single question. If the United States was breaking apart, should Britain step back in? In Mexico, French troops began landing on the coast, advancing inland while Washington was distracted. And in New York Harbor, Russian warships would soon anchor in full view of the city, flying a flag few Americans expected to see. To Americans, the war felt all-consuming. To the rest of the world, it looked like a moment of opportunity. Empires do not rush into chaos blindly. They circle. They test. They wait for weakness to reveal itself. And for the first time since independence, the United States looked vulnerable enough to tempt them all at once. Yet no one struck. Not Britain. Not France. Not Russia. Despite how close the world came, the knives were never used. Understanding why requires going to the moment when intervention came closest, when the American Civil War nearly became an international war. In November 1861, a single American warship nearly dragged the British Empire into war. The USS San Jacinto intercepted the British mail steamer Trent and forcibly removed two Confederate diplomats bound for Europe. The act violated international law, and when the news reached London, the reaction was immediate and explosive. British newspapers erupted in outrage. The incident was framed not as a misunderstanding, but as an insult to British sovereignty. Across Parliament and the press, the language sharpened. Honor had been challenged. Retaliation was expected. Inside the British government, the response moved quickly from anger to preparation. Prime Minister Lord Palmerston authorized military planning within days. Troops were rushed toward Canada. Royal Navy vessels were placed on alert. War with the United States, unthinkable only weeks earlier, was now being discussed in operational terms. From London's perspective, the temptation was real. The Union was divided, its armies inexperienced, its future uncertain. Britain relied heavily on Southern cotton, and a fractured America posed fewer long-term challenges to British power than a reunited one. Intervention no longer felt abstract. It felt possible. But possibility collided with cost. Any war with the United States would not be fought in Europe. It would be fought in North America. Canada would become the front line. Defending thousands of miles of border against a mobilized American population promised enormous expense and unpredictable escalation. Even a weakened United States would be dangerous to confront. Then the crisis narrowed to something far smaller and far more human. In fact, war came down to a single piece of paper. The first draft of Britain's ultimatum to Washington was so aggressive that Abraham Lincoln could not have accepted it without surrendering national honor. Rejection would have meant war. But before the letter was sent, it passed through one final set of hands. Prince Albert, the husband of Queen Victoria, was dying. Confined to bed and gravely ill, he reviewed the ultimatum and rewrote it, softening its language just enough to give the United States a dignified way out. The revised message allowed Washington to release the diplomats without humiliation. Albert died only weeks later. Within that narrow space, between drafts, history turned. The Union released the prisoners. Britain stepped back. The war that seemed inevitable never came. The moment mattered because it revealed how close the world truly was. Britain had been provoked, prepared, and tempted. And yet, at the final instant, restraint prevailed. Not because intervention was impossible, but because the cost of crossing that line was finally understood. If even Britain would not take that step, every other power took note. From that moment on, the question was no longer whether the United States was weak, but whether any prize was worth the price of striking it. After the Trent Affair, European capitals pulled back from the edge, but they did not relax. If intervention was ever going to happen, it would require confidence that the United States truly was weak enough to break. To answer that question, Europe did not send armies. It sent men with notebooks. British, Prussian, and other European officers crossed the Atlantic as military observers, attaching themselves to Union and Confederate forces. One of the most notable was Arthur Fremantle, a British Guards officer who traveled freely through the Confederacy in 1863. Others, like the Prussian officer Justus Scheibert, observed the Union armies in the field. Their task was simple: decide whether America's war revealed strength or fragility. What they saw confirmed their prejudices. At early battles like Bull Run, Fremantle watched American units lose cohesion almost immediately. Lines dissolved under pressure. Officers struggled to control volunteers who had never faced sustained fire. To European professionals trained in rigid formations, it looked amateurish, almost embarrassing. Scheibert was equally dismissive. He mocked the way Union soldiers dug trenches and relied on field works rather than advancing in clean lines. To him, it signaled fear and lack of discipline. European doctrine still prized movement, order, and decisiveness. American soldiers, by contrast, seemed to hide. These observations traveled back to Europe stripped of context. What the observers recorded as weakness was, in fact, adaptation. But it did not look like progress yet. The scale of the war was acknowledged, but its methods were misunderstood. Europe saw chaos, not evolution. That misunderstanding mattered. If American armies were poorly led and tactically crude, then the risk of intervention looked manageable. The United States appeared dangerous in theory, but unimpressive in execution. The temptation to act did not disappear. It sharpened. And yet there was an irony the observers missed. The trenches Scheibert ridiculed and the dispersed formations Fremantle criticized were not signs of collapse. They were early responses to industrial firepower. Europe would learn this lesson later, at a far higher cost. For now, the reports had their effect. They reassured decision-makers that America was not yet a military equal. And with that reassurance came a new question. If the United States truly could not stop them, who would be bold enough to move first? France did not wait long to answer. While Britain hesitated and Europe debated, France acted. In late 1861, as Union and Confederate armies locked into a grinding stalemate, French troops began landing on the coast of Mexico. Officially, the mission was about unpaid debts. In reality, it was about power and timing. Emperor Napoleon III understood the moment better than most. With the United States consumed by civil war, the Monroe Doctrine existed only on paper. Washington protested in words, but lacked the strength to enforce them. For France, this was a rare opening, the chance to expand influence in the Western Hemisphere without confronting American resistance. French forces moved inland with confidence. By 1863, they had installed Archduke Maximilian of Habsburg as Emperor of Mexico, backed by European arms and prestige. It was a direct challenge to the order the United States had long claimed to uphold, but one delivered just far enough away to avoid immediate retaliation. The message was unmistakable. France believed the United States was too divided, too distracted, and too weak to respond. Intervention had already begun, just not on American soil. Napoleon III was testing how far American weakness truly extended. Yet even France stopped short of the final step. Despite quiet contacts with the Confederacy and occasional hints of recognition, Paris never crossed the diplomatic line. No formal alliance, no declaration, no military coordination. The risk remained too great. French leaders understood something essential. Occupying Mexico was one thing, provoking a future United States was another. If the Union survived, it would not forget who had exploited its crisis. Intervention had to remain deniable, reversible, and limited. France's move revealed the true shape of the world's reaction. The Civil War did not freeze global politics. It warped them. Powers advanced where American pressure receded, but they avoided actions that would bind them to America's fate. And as French troops marched in Mexico, another great power appeared to move in the opposite direction, sailing not toward opportunity, but toward safety, in a way that would surprise almost everyone watching. In the fall of 1863, residents of New York and San Francisco witnessed an unexpected sight. Russian warships flying the imperial flag steamed into American harbors and anchored in full view of the public. Newspapers celebrated the arrival as proof that the Union was not alone, that a great power had chosen sides. The appearance was intentional. So was the misunderstanding. Russia's decision had little to do with rescuing the United States and everything to do with fear of Britain. Tensions between London and St. Petersburg were high, and Russian leaders worried that if war broke out in Europe, their fleets could be trapped or destroyed in British-controlled waters. Sending them across the Atlantic placed those ships beyond reach, preserving Russian naval power no matter what happened at home. But strategy does not exclude symbolism. Tsar Alexander II was personally sympathetic to Abraham Lincoln and hostile to the Confederacy, which he saw as an aristocratic rebellion against a legitimate state. By allowing his fleets to anchor in American ports, he sent a message, subtle, deniable, but unmistakable, that Russia preferred a united United States to a fractured one. For the Union, the effect was powerful. At a moment when European intervention still felt possible, the presence of Russian warships carried reassurance. It suggested that any move against the United States might have broader consequences than expected. Even if no formal alliance existed, the optics mattered. For Russia, the arrangement was ideal. It protected its navy, strengthened ties with a potential future partner, and cost nothing in blood or commitment. Support was offered without obligation, friendship without entanglement. The episode exposed a deeper truth about the world's reaction. Even apparent allies were acting first to protect themselves. Sympathy existed, but it was filtered through fear. And that fear of escalation, of miscalculation, of future retaliation, continued to hold the world just short of intervention. While Russia safeguarded its fleet, other states found less dramatic ways to profit from the war. They did not send warships, they sent merchants. And through trade, they reshaped the conflict's global footprint without ever firing a shot. Not every country reacted to the American Civil War with warships or diplomacy. Some reacted with ledgers. As the Union blockade tightened around the Confederate coast, the world's most important export, cotton, suddenly vanished from global markets. The shock rippled outward, and for states positioned to respond, it created opportunity. The Ottoman Empire was one of them. For decades, it had been a secondary supplier of cotton to European manufacturers, overshadowed by the scale and efficiency of the American South. The blockade changed that overnight. European demand did not disappear, it scrambled. Ottoman merchants expanded production, trade routes shifted, and revenue flowed into ports that had previously played a minor role in global textile supply. These changes carried political consequences. To protect its commercial advantage, the Ottoman government aligned its policies carefully. Confederate ships were restricted from Ottoman ports. Trade agreements with the Union were strengthened. None of this was framed as ideological commitment. It was adaptation, quiet, practical, and profitable. Prussia reacted in a different but equally revealing way. Its interest in the Civil War was not economic so much as reputational. As Prussia pursued the unification of the German states, its leaders were keenly aware of how they were perceived by liberal and nationalist audiences. Open hostility toward the Union would have damaged that image, especially as the war increasingly came to be associated with the abolition of slavery. So Prussia signaled sympathy without risk. Diplomatic tone mattered more than action. By aligning itself rhetorically with the Union's cause, Prussia gained political capital at home while remaining free of foreign entanglements. The war became a mirror in which Prussia could reflect a modern identity without paying the price of intervention. Together, these responses revealed the breadth of the world's engagement. Even states far from the battlefield were adjusting, benefiting, and positioning themselves. The Civil War was not isolated. It was reorganizing trade, reputation, and influence across continents. And yet, for all this activity, something remained strikingly consistent. Everyone found ways to act, except in the one way that mattered most. No one crossed the final line. No one intervened directly. Understanding why means looking not at any single country, but at the moment when all of them reach the same conclusion and step back together. By the later years of the war, the pattern was impossible to miss. Britain had nearly fought. France had advanced next door. Russia had sailed in force. Others had profited quietly or reshaped their image from afar. The world was not indifferent to the American Civil War. It was deeply engaged. And yet, at the decisive moment, every major power stopped at the same invisible line. The reason was not sympathy. It was fear, carefully calculated and widely shared. Intervening in the United States would not have been a limited act. Any formal recognition, military alliance, or armed involvement risked escalation into a wider war whose boundaries no one could control. Canada would burn. Atlantic trade would shatter. Colonial defenses would be exposed. The costs were immediate and measurable, while the gains were uncertain and temporary. Just as important was what the war revealed over time. The United States did not collapse. Its armies grew larger, more disciplined, and more destructive. Its industry expanded under pressure. Its government centralized power and learned to sustain mass warfare. What had looked like weakness in 1861 began to look like endurance by 1864. Foreign leaders noticed. A divided America was tempting. A reunited America would be dangerous. Any state that intervened and failed to finish the job would face a future enemy far stronger than before, one that would remember exactly who had tried to take advantage of its moment of vulnerability. So the knives were put away. The world had circled a wounded republic, tested its defenses, and weighed its options. In the end, restraint proved safer than conquest, not because the United States was loved, but because it was too costly to break. That is how the world reacted to the American Civil War, not with rescue, not with conquest, but with something far more revealing, the decision to step back and let the outcome speak for itself.